Hello and Happy New Year to all of you. Um, this is my first podcast for the year 2025, and I think what I'll do is I'll start with a brief review of everything that I did last year and see what's going to happen in the year 2025 and what we hope to see. So overall, from the geopolitical point of view, we're seeing a lot of change going on. A lot of regimes have collapsed. The Syrian regime has collapsed. We see Ukraine and Russia. We also see changes in Europe and in America as well. It has a 1920s feel about it. It's the end of a big war, a big turmoil, and a lot of disruption has come about because of it. And as a consequence to all this disruption, there's rays of light and hope out there in those conflict areas, and it's all for progress at the end of the day. Um, so in Ukraine, you have the Kursk offensive. This is Ukraine's invasion into the Russian territory, and the purpose of that is to deplete resources of the Russians. By bringing the war onto the Russian land, it's taking a bit of war, away from what's going on in Ukraine, and by doing so, they're showing to the world that Russia is not as strong as it used to be. Um, it also shows that there's hope there, that they will continue fighting. I was watching a documentary there last week where Ukrainian soldiers, though tired they may be, they do want to see a Ukrainian victory where they get back Crimea and they get back the lands that were taken from them, and to get compensation for it. Um, that being said, when I think about it, like Putin, as a dictator, he's done what every dictator does. He's divided his people. He's left his people confused, uneducated, with no real option but to follow him, because they know that if Putin and his regime was to fall, it would be total and utter chaos. And they don't want that. Nobody wants that. And I suppose when Trump said that he wanted to bring a deal about on the 1st of January, it's now the 3rd of January that I'm recording this, and he's starting to drag his heels on it as such, because um, they're two very extreme sides to this deal. Firstly, the Ukrainians want outright victory, and the Russians, they want outright victory as well. Um, the deal there is to find a common ground between them, a way for Putin to actually retreat and pull back his forces out of Ukraine. Um, if that was to happen, at least the fighting would stop. Then it would make things the war would become a policing action, and it's better to have that sort of peace than to have another year, couple of years of outright fighting. The statistics coming in from the Ukraine war, they're talking about well over 1 million Russian soldiers dead, um, thousands of tanks destroyed, and all sorts of material and weapons and people have been destroyed, and economies have been. The Russian economy is on its last legs. It'll be interesting to see how it all pans out, but I hope to see by the end of this year. I would say that the fight will continue. I don't think it'll go in either country's favor, because their goals are so extreme. Their goals are so extreme. So that being said, what other hotspots we have? We could talk about Israel and their push into Palestine. There's been genocide. There's been a lot of horrible war crimes being done on behalf of the Israelis, on account of the fact that the Palestinians had broken their defenses nearly over a year ago and kidnapped a lot of their people and murdered and slaughtered and caused an awful lot of heinous crimes. And it just brings me to question, like, the whole reason that the Israelis have permission to push so deeply into Palestine and to also push into northern Syria is because they want to create a buffer zone between themselves and Iran and the Iranian backed Hezbollah and the IS fighters as well. The Israelis are pushing back like that, but the underlying reason that they're able to do that was on account of the heinous crimes that was committed well over a year ago. And I just keep asking myself, like, did they calculate that? Did they actually let their defenses down to allow this to happen so that they could gain a strategic advantage in the area? But again, it's something that we'd like to see later on. Syria as well. You had the uprising and the fall of Bashir Assad's dictatorship. Just recently, I heard that Bashir is suffering from poisoning in Moscow. I wonder, is that connected, or what's that all about? But from what I get from the Syrian conflict is that it's a delayed Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a revolution that started a few years back, and it brought down Libya's Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, and there was civil war, or there was civil strife in Egypt. But in Syria, Assad clamped down hard on his people, and he partnered up with Russia, and between the two of them, they clamped down very hard on their people. So really what we're seeing is they delayed revolution in Syria. So now we're starting to see them catching up, I suppose, to looking for a better solution for Syria. And so far, it looks that there's an awful lot of factional fighting between the Kurds, between Syrians, between the Druze. The United States is in there fighting IS. The Israelis have been pounding positions in Syria under their concerns for weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons, falling into the wrong hands. That being said, Iran, they have lost their link to Hezbollah. They're saying that it's not going to be an issue for them. However, it's certainly going to be much more difficult for the likes of the Houthi rebels and for Hezbollah to maintain or to put up any sort of military struggle against the Israelis, or cause strife in that region. What else can I look at? Europe. Europe, after 3 years of seeing what's happening in Ukraine, Europe is now ready to just there over the year, there was an exercise with over 100,000 troops from various nations in Europe, and they were doing exercises, interoperation exercises. There was also a Baltic naval exercise as well, and the purpose of that is basically to deter Russia, to send a message to Russia that Europe is ready for anything that Russia may threaten to do. And furthermore, by having 100,000 troops on standby, they could also potentially be deployed into Ukraine if it came to, if there was a political push for that to happen. Also, on a side there, the Baltic naval exercise recently over the Christmas, there was cable dredging going on up in the Balkan Sea. I think it was between Finland and another country up there around Finland, but apparently it was a Russian tanker that dropped its anchor and dragged it across the cables. Now, the Finnish authorities were able to detain that vessel, and they did an investigation into that tanker, and they found a load of surveillance equipment there, and they found one of the crew members was actually very proficient in technical expertise in that area as well. So it's very suspect, and it just goes to show that although the Russian Navy are allowed to transit through European waters, if they want to do anything clandestine, they just get an ordinary boat and pile a load of stuff into it and do the dirty. and hope that nobody's watching. That being said, the talk for subsea surveillance has come up, and I did read a book a few years back. It was about submarines in the Atlantic, and there is a surveillance, a sonar, or some sort of surveillance system set up all across the Atlantic, designed specifically for hunting down and spotting and tracking Russian submarines, and that was way back in the 1980s. And I can only imagine just how much that particular network has been upgraded and upgraded throughout the many years there. So when the Finnish authorities came back and said that they're confident they knew exactly which ship caused the dredging of the cables, I'm pretty sure that there's sensors there underneath the sea that's able to, they're able to sense an anchor. They can actually hear anchor dropping into the water and hitting the ground. And between satellite photography and deep sea sensor suites, I'm sure that they're well able to pinpoint and police what's going on, and they'll be able to better. They will now show basically that all those sensitive cables are under surveillance, and that it would not be a good idea for anybody to try dredging up data cables or any sort of cables or pipes underneath the seas around Europe. Um, what else can I say? National. I suppose national. What were the big news about our country's defence forces? The question of NATO partnership. We are partners with NATO, but we're not fully fledged. We're not fully NATO. And as such, like, we have our neutrality, and the question of neutrality has been brought up. And there's a lot of pluses and minuses to joining NATO, because firstly, we've never had to be part of NATO during the Cold War. We never needed it because we're sandwiched between the United States Armed Forces, and on one side, and the British Armed Forces on the other side. And on top of that, you have the Germans, the French, and the Italians, and they all have they spend vast amounts of money on protection and policing the Northern Hemisphere. So, is it really necessary that a small little country like Ireland should join NATO? Perhaps not. However, firstly, the argument against joining NATO would be that we've been neutral. A lot of we have a historical reputation for being a neutral country, and that we're handy in that, like, if there's any policing to be done between Ukraine and Russia, for example, both sides would be amenable to a non-aligned, non-NATO neutral country coming in and doing that. But that being said, peace enforcement, it's not very effective. It ends up being just observation and reaction. And our mission in Israel, it just shows that the Israelis can just walk all over whatever territory and do whatever they like, and there's not a lot we can do except watch and report back, and try some sort of policing action in there. But it doesn't work when you have a very asymmetrical type situation like the Palestinians and the Israelis. The argument for NATO, I did a few podcasts about the costs of actually keeping a squadron of jet aircraft, and it's extremely expensive. And for the government to go it alone, to have a squadron of jet fighters, firstly, they'd have to provide an awful lot of, it'll cost an awful lot. There'll have to be a lot of training sorties being done. There'll have to be an awful lot of deployments, and if those machines are not serving any particular purpose, then it'll be seen as an unnecessary cost. So that being said, like by joining NATO, what you're doing is you're committing a certain percentage of your government budget towards defence. And right now, we're one of the lowest spending lowest defence spending countries in Europe and the world. Well, in Europe at least. Um, so it wouldn't whether to join NATO or not. The positives of joining NATO would be that we are assuring the defence of our country, because the Russians, they are patrolling just off our own boundaries. There's Russian bombers flying into Atlantic. There's Russian submarines in the Atlantic, and it seems that the Russians are starting to get used to the idea of sending their ships into our territory for exercise reasons. But we also noticed there during the year a spy ship, the Yantar, or I think it was, yeah, the Yantar. It was patrolling around in Irish waters, and under the maritime rules, we couldn't do much about it except watch what they were doing. Um, but that being said, the Navy, there was issues with the Navy. There was a report done to say that the Navy is under strength in terms of qualified personnel to keep the ships going. Um, the the Navy did come back and say that there are people being trained in the pipeline, and that they're confident that those ships will be manned properly, and going forward that we will have an operational Navy. And I hope to think so. But I do know that there's a new HR director, a director of human resources in the Department of Defence, and he'll be looking at that situation, and he'll be looking at it from a point of view of cost benefit analysis and global trends. And the global trend is, the question is, do you keep that service? Do you keep it nationalised? Do you have the government finance it, or do you have private contractors to step in? And so the HR director, he's probably looking at a hybrid solution where you would have the state purchasing the infrastructure, and probably contract out to some other human resources type company that will supply the crews to have those crews operating in the Navy, perhaps. I don't know. It does it's all about keeping the costs down, because right now the government, the pressure is on the government for a lot of other different things like housing and social welfare and health. Defence doesn't come up very much. But that being said, just over the year we got two new inland patrol vessels, the Evine and the Gubnot. We have two offshore patrol vessels there, the Joyce and the Beckett. Could there be something on the menu for a multi-role vessel, something along the lines of the HMAS Canterbury? A ship like that would have a crew of about 150. In order to keep that, in order to keep a ship like that going, you'd have to have 150 crew. Then you'd have to have 150 crew standing by, or you know, if you had it in shifts. And then on top of that, you'd have about 200, 300 people maintaining a large ship like that. Like, so if something like the purchase of an MRV, and if there was a hybrid solution where the Department of Defence would spend a couple of 100 million on a large ship like that and then contract it out, it'd be on the private contractors to make sure that that machine is well maintained, well run, and actually deploying and doing some interesting stuff. That being said, what would an MRV do? Well, firstly, it's a very significant ship. It can hold up to 4 helicopters, about 50 different vehicles, and about 40 containers. And on top of that, it can carry about 500 personnel on top of that. It is a floating fortress. Something like that would, for our international roles, like if we had to send a company down to Ukraine for policing it, or something like that would be very significant. If something like that was to pull up into the outside Trieste, everybody would see that the Irish have landed, and the Irish are very qualified and very capable of doing something like that. Furthermore, there was an exercise. We have commitments to the northern flank of Europe. There was an Arctic exercise way back in 2005, and for that, the Irish government had to rent out a ship that would take a company of cavalry and personnel all the way up to, I think it was Finland, for an Arctic exercise for a few months. So again, something like that would be a great way of showing that we take our commitments internationally very seriously. And a third reason would be the defense role. Like the next time the Russian Navy comes down into our waters, then we would be able to meet them with a very significant ship flanked with 2 offshore patrol vessels and 2 inshore patrol vessels. And all of them, of course, would have to be armed up with the latest anti-submarine warfare and anti-ship missiles, and a suite of sensors there to do anti-whatever. And of course, where would all that come from? You'd probably send the fleet over to France or to Britain to rent out a scatter of missiles and a scatter of sensor suites, and just borrow it for a couple of months until the threat is gone, and then send it back. The Air Corps, this year they're looking to get a new government jet, I believe. In 2027, they're looking to get new light helicopters, something to replace the current Airbus, I think it is. Also, there's a program in place to replace out the AW139s. They're looking for a medium-heavy variant out there. Also, they're also looking into upgrades in Beldonnell. And what more, with the Army, just over the year, there was a report done that they were looking to set up a centre of excellence in Gormanstown. They'll probably go ahead with that. Also, late last year, the cavalry, a company of our military vehicles, went over and took part in the exercises in Europe. I think they went to Germany, and the whole purpose of that exercise was about interoperability and communication and logistics within Europe. There is possibility there that if Europe does actually deploys to Ukraine, there would be an Irish contingent involved with that. Also, for myself personally, I was very happy. I took great joy in realizing that I brought my weight down to my ideal weight. It took me about 3 years. Where do I go from there? It's all about military standards. So there's a fitness level 5 there. So if I can push that, it'd be great to have that by the summer. Over last year, I discovered stick fighting, Bathrock, swimming in the sea. I didn't do any climbing this year. I wanted to go cycling as well, and I didn't do any airsoft. But sure, there's a lot ahead for me in 2025. So that's all I have to say. Looking forward to the next podcast, and hopefully we'll all have a good year. Take care.